All right, hello. So today we are going to talk about, excuse me, the giallo film genre and Suspiria, one of our horror films. So first we're going to dive into giallo films. So originally giallo, this is obviously an Italian word, right? And they started as a literary genre. So they were kind of trashy, like pulp novels that were like mysteries, thrillers, where there was a lot of murder and it was all sort of salacious. But now it usually refers to horror that has a mystery or thriller element, specifically horror films. There's not a lot of giallo films anymore. There were a lot of giallo films in the like 70s. Giallo actually had a really big influence on the American slasher genre, which started not soon after, or it started after the giallo movement really took off in Italy, and it really influenced early slasher, especially like Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween. So, characteristics of giallo. So it's really similar to exploitation films, which were a big thing in the 70s. Blaxploitation is a good example. So these are films that it doesn't necessarily mean exploitation like in a bad way, like that people were being exploited, but they usually were like extremely violent, and they did this to kind of shock audiences, but also kind of delight them a little bit too. They would usually have really stylized camera work, and really vivid use of color, and they would feature killers that had masks and black gloves, as well as music that was really kind of off-putting and jarring, and scores. The score for this film we're about to watch is fantastic. And a big thing about giallo is that often the protagonists were women who are being gaslit in some way, so whose testimonies aren't taken seriously, or who are even actively gaslit by authority figures in their life. So, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with the phrase gaslighting, but in case you're not, gaslighting means manipulating someone in order to get them to question their own sanity. So, gaslighting is an abuse tactic, and this is something that people will do to make you kind of question your own memory or even make you think you're losing your mind. So, an example would be like if I slapped you in the face and then later, a week later, you were like, no, you slapped me in the face. And I was like, what? No, I didn't. I would never slap you in the face. That's kind of an extreme example. This comes from a play called Gaslight, where a man and a friend of his decide to drive his wife insane by slowly dimming the gaslight in their house and telling her that they don't notice anything different. And so they try to drive her insane. You know, super healthy marriage. All right, so let's talk about the master of giallo, Dario Argento. So he's an Italian filmmaker. He was super influential in the 70s and 80s, especially in the horror genre. And he kind of melded horror with giallo and created this sort of modern giallo genre. He uses a lot of color and patterns. His films are really visually striking, especially Suspiria, and the basically he has this trilogy of films that are all sort of about witches, and they're all really visually striking. So Suspiria is Dario Argento's most successful film. It's a cult classic, which I'm sure y'all kind of know what this means, but that means it has a small following. It has a big following, but it's not like a mainstream movie. So a lot of cult classics, people will, get together to screen them. Rocky Horror Picture Show is probably the most popular or familiar cult classic. Other examples are like The Room, Phantom of the Paradise, things like that, where they aren't like widely known or mainstream necessarily, but they have huge followings. The soundtrack for this film is by the Goblins, and it's dope and weird, and it's supposed to be really unsettling. And this movie is set at a ballet school in Germany, where things get really, it's almost kind of like fairy tale-esque. We have our protagonist, Susie Banyan, who kind of descends into this horrifying fairy tale world where she doesn't totally understand what's going on. And you might not totally understand what's going on. That's okay. this is not a film where I necessarily want you to focus on the plot. The plot is extremely simple. Well, it's not. It's kind of hard to get, but it's extremely simple in its construction, which is just witches. And it's confusing on purpose. Argento tries to make it confusing. So I don't necessarily want you to focus on the substance. This is a film where I more want you to focus on the style. Something else that is going to make this film seem kind of jarring or unnatural to you is that the voices are actually dubbed. So the cast was multicultural, and the actors just spoke in their native language, and then they were dubbed over in English after. This was a really common practice in Italian filmmaking, so it doesn't, but it does make it kind of campy, which is super fun. So this film is definitely campy. If you guys aren't familiar with camp, oh gosh, I should have written a definition. It's basically like movies that are kind of intentionally over the top, especially like aesthetically and in terms of plot and acting. So if any of you have ever seen John Waters films, which I don't know if you have, but he's kind of the definer of American camp. Okay, so I hope you guys like Suspiria. Like I said, focus a lot more on experiencing it in terms of your senses, and not as much trying to follow the plot beat by beat. Okay? All right. I hope you guys like it. This is one of my faves.